So now that we have the first two pieces done, the one that focuses on composition and the other that focuses on the elements and principles of art, we're going to work on piecing those back together into one final project. And the purpose of this is to not only continue to practice both sets of those artistic rules, but to also see that even if you're finished with a project, whether you're not happy with it or you want to take it to the next level, there's always things that you can do to further your project and take it to that next step or take it a little bit further. So definitely when you're finished with something, ask yourself if there's anything else you can do with it. Whether it is cut it up and piece it back together somehow, or if it's getting different materials, cutting those out, putting them on top, or collaging, maybe adding text. But there's always ways to take things further, and that's what I'm going to be looking for on all of your projects. So this is just a great way to take things to that next level, especially if it's something that you're not happy with and you want to try to do something else with it. But you're going to take those two pieces of art and you can only use what was created on both of those pieces to put together a whole new piece, other than obviously the background piece of paper that you might put it on. So the first thing that must be included in this last piece is a clear focal point. So make sure that you have a clear focal point in your image. You need to follow all of the compositional rules that we practiced. So you should still have the rule of thirds followed, leading line, framing, and lead space. And then you need to follow all of the elements and principles that we practiced as well. So that would be balance, movement and rhythm, repetition or pattern, unity, and texture. And then the last thing that I want to be the main focus of this piece is having a clear foreground, middle ground, and background. I think that a lot of times when you're creating artwork, people forget about this and the importance of having a foreground, middle ground, and background. So make sure that every piece of art that you work on from now on has this in it. So always double check, do you have a background? Is there somewhere in the middle? And then what is the foreground? And make sure that you pay attention and focus on each of those pieces to have plenty of detail on them as well. But I want to dive a little bit deeper into foreground. I know that it is pretty straightforward with what it is, but the foreground of a landscape is, or really any piece of art, is generally closer to the bottom of the composition, although it's not always the case. So for most pieces of art, you'll want to have that background towards the bottom, and that's just naturally where the foreground would fall because it's closest to the viewer. So whatever is closest to the viewer is your foreground. Because this part of the scene is closest to the viewer, the objects are going to appear larger. So whatever your focal point is most likely going to be your foreground, in addition to maybe a smaller piece off to the side. So your foreground should always be the biggest piece of your image. It's also going to have the most contrast. So something that has a lot of highlights and a lot of really dark shadows is going to jump forward. So you want to think of ways to make your foreground jump forward. In this image here, it definitely has a lot of contrast. You can see the really white spots on the face are the highlights compared to the background. They're definitely the main areas that will jump out. And then the hair as well is really contrasted with highlights and shadows. So there's areas that are dark, areas that are light, and that's going to make up the foreground. And then you'll notice that the background, which we'll talk about this later, but the background is more muted. So brighter colors in the foreground, more contrast in the foreground. The objects should be larger. Here's another example where you have the tree as our foreground, which also is the focal point. But it stands out because it does take up the most space. It has more contrast, so there's really dark areas and there's really light areas as well. All right, so now we're going to look at the background. The background of a scene is the furthest away. So make sure when you're creating your background that you're still focused on having some different colors, some different value change, but have it obviously behind your foreground. It gives some context to the scene, so where your scene might be taking place. So in this image on the right, there's clouds that allude to the rest of the landscape. But if you're doing something more abstract, Maybe keep some lines consistent or colors consistent with your focal point. Because items in the background are meant to appear further away, they're much smaller in size, duller in color, and contain less detail than objects that are close to the viewer. So just think the opposite of your focal point. You want the colors to fade into the background. So come up with colors that are dull, so that's more grays or desaturated colors that are not bright. So if you're taking a color directly out of your paint can, um, that should not be going on the background. That would be more foreground. So background, you'll always want to mix black and white with whatever color you're using to desaturate it. Or you could mix the complementary color. So if you want blue, like this image here, if you want a blue sky, mix orange with it, which is the complementary color, and that will desaturate it or dull that color down so that it's not as bright and it doesn't stand out too much. And then there's going to be less detail, so less highlights and shadows. Everything should be almost one value. And then smaller objects. So you can see in the background the trees get a lot smaller than the focal point. So here's another example. Very muted sky. The mountains are blurry, so backgrounds usually will have less detail, so it's a little bit more faded, blurry, compared to the focal point that has that contrast of highlights and shadows. All right, and then the middle ground is just the space that naturally occurs between the foreground and background. So if it's a landscape, it's just that space in the middle. And again, I would not necessarily do extreme contrast or no contrast. I would do something right in the middle for both of those. So if your background is really desaturated, maybe saturate the middle ground a little bit more, and then the foreground should have the most saturation. So make sure you're taking things back a step for each section of your artwork. And then here's an example I wanted to show of an abstract piece using foreground, middle ground, background. You can see that the focal point would be over here, so these lines would be your foreground. The middle ground would be more of that space or that texture that's on the blue background. So think of having multiple layers. Focus on at least 3 layers, and that foreground should be your focal point. And then here's a few examples of a digital example if you're going that route. So just having the background color, so you can see that white and the background blend really easily, where that background is almost transparent or see-through. The middle ground is that medium value, foreground is black, stands out the most as the focal point. So again, for this last piece where you're cutting things up, you can check out the video below this where I show a time lapse of cutting things up, putting them together, and walk you through my mindset of how I'm creating the foreground, background, middle ground with all of those compositional rules and all of those elements of art as well.